Okay, so this is the last session, so hang in there. This is going to be very interesting, particularly to the economists in the room, but hopefully to everybody. I would like to introduce the entire group, so I'm going to start off with Anne-Marie Kuhns, who's speaking on behalf of Ephraim Liebtag. And Anne-Marie is an economist in the food markets branch of the Food Economics Division at USDA. She forecasts retail food price inflation and provides analysis on current price trends. And her research focuses on consumer food purchasing decisions and related topics. Our second speaker will be Vic Oliveira, who's a research economist at USDA, whose work focuses primarily on WIC, to be followed by Tatiana Andreeva, who's the Director of Economic Initiatives at the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity, which is now at the University of Connecticut. And Tatiana's research focuses on the determinants of access to healthy food in low-income communities and the role of economic incentives in food choices and diet, including food prices, taxation, and federal assistance and nutrition programs. And then finally, we're going to finish up with Ed Harper, who's the director at the Office of Program Integrity of Child Nutrition Programs at USDA Food and Nutrition Service. And Ed has extensive experience with the analysis of national food and nutrition programs, including regulations implemented in response to the 2006 report. We welcome Anne-Marie to start the session.
Great. Well, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some information for you on phase one of your study. And as Marianne mentioned, a lot of the work I do involves food prices, also some analysis on store formats. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about retail food prices pertaining specifically to some WIC-specific foods, also the store formats, and also just ending with a little bit of information on store access. So first, to just get started, I just want to give a little background on food prices. And here we have what retail food price inflation has looked like over the past 20 years. And overall, the average rate of inflation over this time period has been 2.6%. And I think what you notice most when you first look at this chart is that food price inflation has become slightly more volatile since 2007, and that's comparing it to the previous decade. In 2007 and 2008, we saw food price inflation slightly higher than average as farm-level prices for grains, rice, and oilseeds rose. And then the Great Recession hit, which helped put downward pressure on retail food price inflation. And in 2009 and 10, we saw rates of inflation that were just under 1%. Again, we see some volatility in 2011, 2013, and finally in 2014, retail food price inflation was very near the historical average. It was 2.4%. And this is for overall food at home inflation, so there is, of course, variation among the food subcategories. So for instance, in 2014, retail food inflation for eggs was 8.4%, whereas retail inflation for breads and cereal products was 0.2%. Now we look at kind of how retail food price inflation compares to economy-wide inflation. And you'll notice that over the last several years, it's often outpaced economy-wide inflation. And one of the reasons for the relative, the larger increases in retail food price inflation over economy-wide inflation is that it's often higher and more volatile than the other subcomponents of the consumer price index. And that's except for transportation and medical care costs. Another thing to note is that housing and transportation do make up the largest consumer expenditures, so they're given the highest weight in the overall consumer price index. So there are many factors, because we've talked now kind of what the movement of retail food price inflation has been, and there are many factors that play a role in the prices that we actually pay at the grocery store. And so to kind of describe that, I like to look at the ERS retail food dollar. And this is telling us for every dollar we spend at the grocery store, how many cents of that dollar goes towards each factor of production. So you can see that the largest factors affecting retail prices are retail and wholesale trade and also food processing. And these are, as far as the costs and prices associated with these factors of production, they're relatively stable compared to categories such as farm production, which involves commodity prices, and also even transportation. So a lot of times the fluctuations we see in retail food prices month over month or year over year are more driven by changes in commodity prices than changes in some of the other factors of production. Now I wanted to take a look at our, one of our data products, which is the food price outlook. And we have 12 to 18 month ahead forecasts for several of the major food categories within the Consumer Price Index. And just to kind of explain this graph, the shaded area represents kind of a range of uncertainty. So our forecasts are published in 1 percentage point intervals. And so this is saying we expect inflation to fall somewhere in between this range for 2015. And that's for these categories we have listed. And you can see that most of the categories we're expecting to increase between 2 and 3.5% in 2015. And that really is in line with the historical average, which was 2.6%, to perhaps slightly below or slightly above. But I don't want to get into too much detail right here because a lot of these categories are not specific to the WIC package. So we also do produce some forecasts for more WIC-specific foods. And again, we have the 1 percentage point interval for our forecasts. And you'll notice that all of these forecasts, we don't expect any of them to increase more than 3.5% in 2015. In fact, some of the categories we are expecting to see inflation which is slightly lower than average, especially when you're looking at the center aisles of the grocery store. And this was very similar to what we saw in 2014. A lot of those packaged items, such as breads and even breakfast cereals, saw inflation that was lower than average. And in 2015, we expect breakfast cereals to increase 0.5% to 1.5%, and non-white bread 1.5% to 2.5%. So then we kind of, we're just looking at 2015 for those categories, and now kind of see how prices for some of the WIC-specific foods have been changing over time. So we take a snapshot of 15 years, and here we're actually looking at the actual price index. Previously, we were talking in terms of percentage change. Excuse me. And here I rebased the index for 2000. So 2000, all of these categories are equal to 100. And kind of what you'll notice is that some of these categories have increased in price faster than some of the other categories. For instance, dried beans, peas, and lentils increased much more rapidly over this time period than, say, breakfast cereals. And then additionally, some of the categories are more volatile than others. For instance, peanut butter had a sharp increase in 2011. And so there were more increases for that category than, again, breakfast cereals or even fresh produce. So we've been talking about inflation, but kind of how does this kind of translate into dollars and cents? And so I wanted to show you how average retail food prices have changed over time. And so we used some consumer panel data for several WIC categories, so several categories included in the WIC package: eggs, skim and low-fat milk, and American cheese. And you can kind of see how these prices have changed over time. So all these prices and inflation, we've been talking strictly national averages, national average price changes, but there is, of course, variation geographically. So here, the dotted yellow line represents the 2.4% increase in food prices nationally, and we can kind of see the variation among different cities within the U.S. So some were closely in line with that average, others were higher, and some lower. And there are several reasons that we can see variation among geographic areas. And one of them is that consumers' tastes and preferences are different in different cities. So the Consumer Price Index is weighted by the basket of goods that consumers in that city purchase. So cities that purchased, for instance, in 2014, perhaps more beef and veal, might have seen a higher overall rate of inflation than cities that purchased less of those items. Also, there are differences in transportation costs, the distance traveled, but also the mode of transportation a lot of these goods must take. Obviously, there are differences in prices based on if it has to go on an airplane or even a refrigerated truck. And then lastly, There's also differences in retail overhead costs, changes in retail overhead costs in these different cities. So then we wanted to also look at differences in terms of dollars and cents in these different cities for some of the food categories we've been discussing. And this data comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we didn't use the consumer panel data here because I just wanted to give you a more recent snapshot of average prices. So this is from January of 2015. But you'll notice that the BLS data is a little limited. For some of the categories, you'll see that they're not available. And then you'll also notice that there's no data available for these categories for the Northeast. But you do kind of get the general idea that prices do vary by different cities. And it's interesting to note that it's not just one region that is more expensive than another. Some regions are more expensive for some goods, but not other goods. So switching gears a bit, I want to talk more about the changing retail food landscape. One of the big changes in recent years is that convenience stores and dollar stores are increasing their food offerings. And this is true with a lot of other non-traditional food retailers, so food retailers other than supermarkets and grocery stores. I know I've noticed even going to a local Target that over the last couple of years you've seen much more produce and even meat offerings in these stores than you had seen 10 years ago. Also, competitive strategies really do differ according to the store format. So supercenters are very focused on one-stop shopping and low prices, whereas other formats might be more focused on quality and also customer service, which is sometimes associated with higher prices. Also, there's been expansion for supercenters and club stores throughout the U.S., and we can kind of see this in a map. This is from our Food Environment Atlas. And you can look at the comparison of the number of supercenters and club stores in 2007 versus 2011. So you can definitely see there are much more darker red areas in 2011, and that's just over a 4-year period. And something else interesting to note here is this is talking about supercenters and club stores, but farmers markets have also increased in number over the years. I found a figure that in 1994, there were about 1,700 farmers markets throughout the U.S., and in 2013, that figure was 8,150. And in 2013, that number was actually 4% above what it was in 2012. So this is a way for people to have perhaps more access to fresh produce. And so while the number of club stores and supercenters has been increasing, drug stores and convenience stores still do make up the largest percentage of U.S. market share, and also supermarkets. In fact, supercenters and club stores each only make up 1%. And while convenience stores are the most prevalent format, they do not represent the largest share of consumer expenditures. And this graph is kind of neat. It's using the consumer panel data, and you can see the changes in the share of food at home expenditures spent at the different store formats. And I think what's most interesting is you can see in 1999, supermarkets represented about 80% of that share, and by 2012, it was just above 60%. But then you see the reverse when you're looking at supercenters. It was about 3% in 1999, and it went up to 18% in 2012. But then you see that the other store formats are pretty consistent over those years. So this might be suggesting that consumers are switching from purchasing their foods at supermarkets to supercenters. So here I wanted to highlight a study that was done by both ERS researchers and researchers at the University of California, Davis. And they were looking specifically at the California WIC program. And their study found that smaller retailers charge higher prices for WIC packages than larger retailers. And so this, the results for this was looking specifically at, one of the most redeemed packages, which includes a gallon of low-fat milk, a dozen eggs, a pound of cheese, and either a jar of peanut butter or a pound of beans, peas, or lentils. And what it found was stores with 1 to 2 registers, the average, the median redemption value was just under $20. And if you looked at stores with 10 or more registers, it was $12.95. And you can actually see that there's a bit of a drop when you go to 3 or 4 registers and even 5 and 6, but then above 5 or 6 registers, you don't really see much change. One thing to note is it's not necessarily that these stores are charging higher prices necessarily, because there is a little bit of consumer choice for the WIC packages. They can have some choice on the size of package they purchase and also the brand. And so it could be that consumers who shop at smaller stores might have different preferences than those that are shopping at larger stores. So we looked at differences in the WIC package price by the size of the store, but we can also look at differences in price by the store format. So here again, we're using the consumer panel data, and we're looking at differences in price from traditional, which is supermarkets and grocery stores, versus the non-traditional, which are all the other store formats that we have. And you can see that eggs and American cheese are more expensive at traditional over that time period, but skim milk was cheaper. So it's not necessarily that traditional versus non-traditional is more expensive for all the items. I do want to note, I know there was some interest in fresh fruit and vegetable prices, but unfortunately the consumer panel data, while we do have the price that consumers paid for the fresh produce, we don't have the weight that they purchased, so we weren't able to get those figures. Then I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit about some store access issues. So here we're looking at what in the US is low access. And low access is defined as urban areas that are greater than a mile from a supermarket and rural areas that have to go over 20 miles to reach a supermarket. And overall in the US, 5.3% of Americans fall into this category. So then this is the WIC redemptions per capita in 2012, and this is county level data. And the Food Environment Atlas that this comes from, of course it does have the entire US, but I just selected 2 states here, California and Texas, just so we could see a little bit more detail in the data. And these are 2 states that do have higher WIC participation. But you can see the WIC redemptions per capita, there's larger areas in California and Central California and to the east of Los Angeles. And so when we look at the WIC authorized stores, you'll, not surprisingly so, you'll notice that the same areas have more stores per capita, or more stores, excuse me, in each county. So I do hope that you found this interesting and informative. I do also want to give you some links to the data that I presented, both the food price outlook forecast and also the Food Environment Atlas and the Food Access Research Atlas. And I know that's probably hard to jot that all down, so I do have my contact information along with my 2 colleagues. I would be happy to provide you with more information. Thank you.
Okay, and any questions of clarification from the committee or consultants? Thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Vic.